Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Welcome to my very own pocket dimension. Thank you for being here. I'm Zevin Odelberg. Please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies. Take the beamer, leave the body, the bullets, and the bite marks. Starts now. In the rapidly dimming twilight of February 24th, 1986, LAPD detectives stepped through the gates of a condo complex in Van Nuys, a suburb of Los Angeles. The detectives' faces were etched with stern concentration. The scene that awaited them was grim. Sherri Rasmussen, a 29-year-old nursing director and a newlywed of just 3 months, lay dead in her living room. She was found by her husband, John Ruetten, an engineer who'd arrived home from work at precisely 5:55 p.m. As Ruetten pulled into his driveway, the first thing that caught his eye was the open garage door. Odd. The silver two-door BMW, a cherished engagement gift he'd given to Sherri, was conspicuously missing. He felt an immediate twinge of dread. She'd called in sick to work that day. She should have been home. Swiftly, Ruetten made his way into the house. The living room appeared as if a tornado had swept through. Fragments of shattered porcelain vase were strewn across the floor. A TV wall unit listed to one side, partially torn from the wall. A credenza drawer had been violently pulled out, its papers and documents haphazardly thrown about. Sherri's lifeless body lay amidst the chaos. Her attire, just a robe, t-shirt, and underwear, indicated that she had been taken utterly by surprise. Lyle Mayer, the lead homicide detective on the case, looked around the room, methodically noting each detail. His years on the force told him this had initially been a burglary, until it took an unimaginably dark turn. In his mind, he ran through the likely sequence of events. The burglars probably entered through an unlocked front door. While one of them busied himself ripping electronics from the wall unit, the other intruder likely went upstairs, only to be confronted by Sherri. Mayer surmised that her casual attire suggested that the home invasion had caught her completely unaware. But Sherri Rasmussen was no easy target. Standing at 6 feet tall and athletically built, she fought back with a fierce intensity. The struggle between her and her assailant was nothing short of ferocious, leaving clues that suggested a battle waged on 2 floors of the townhouse. It appears to have started in the dining room on the 2nd floor, where evidence showed that a .38 caliber pistol had been discharged. At least one of those bullets might have struck Rasmussen. In a desperate bid for survival, Sherri Rasmussen seems to have made a run for it. A trail of blood smeared down the stairs. A bloody handprint lingered near the front door, right next to the alarm panel with its panic button. She almost made it, but her assailant was relentless. Back in the living room, signs of a struggle were evident. Sherri had been bitten on her left forearm, possibly during a tussle for the gun. Her head bore the impact of a heavy vase, a blow that probably knocked her off her feet. To finish the grim deed, the assailant grabbed a quilt from across the room, likely to muffle the sound of the gun, and fired more rounds through it, hitting Rasmussen squarely in the chest. She was struck 3 times, her heart, lungs, and spine all pierced by the bullets. A housekeeper in the adjacent unit later told authorities she'd heard a commotion and a scream, but she mistook it for a domestic dispute and didn't call the police. When the dust settled, Sherri Rasmussen lay dead, and her silver BMW was missing from the garage. Yet, puzzlingly, most belongings in the house were untouched. Even Rasmussen's jewelry box sat unopened, plainly visible on her dresser. To Detective Mayer, this suggested a hasty retreat, as if the intruder had been interrupted or scared off. But by what? Or by whom? The details were haunting, each one raising questions that seemed to deepen the mystery. The assailant had seemingly bypassed numerous variables, focusing instead on a violent confrontation that ended in murder. The crime was as bewildering as it was brutal. leaving investigators with a scene that refused to fit the mold of a typical burglary gone wrong. Something about the scene raised questions that tugged at the corner of Mayer's mind. Why were certain valuables left untouched? Why were the electronics dismantled but not taken? And most crucially, if this was a burglary gone wrong, why did it culminate in murder? It was a strange crime scene, one that would stump investigators for years to come. With no immediate suspects and little to go on, the case gradually settled into the backlogs of unsolved murders, casting a long, unanswered shadow over the city of Los Angeles. For 23 agonizing years, Sherri Rasmussen's murder would remain an unsolved mystery. That is, until the advent of forensic science would finally, shockingly, point the finger at one of the most unlikely suspects in LA's long criminal history. It was a long night for Lloyd Mahaney, a criminalist from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. By the time he arrived at Sherri Rasmussen's home, the clock was ticking past 2 a.m., and this was already his second homicide of the night. His task was clear: look for trace evidence, the small details that could speak volumes. Mahaney started by meticulously scouring the area around Rasmussen's lifeless body. He was looking for the minuscule, hair, fibers, any anomaly that could offer a clue. Despite his thoroughness, he found nothing that stood out, nothing that screamed, "Here's your clue." Next, he moved on to a more sensitive aspect of his job, a sexual assault kit. Working with professional precision, Mahaney collected swabs and slides. Then, his eyes landed on something noteworthy: the bite mark on Rasmussen's arm. It was a unique, telling piece of evidence, the kind of detail that could become crucial in the future. He chose a 6-inch swab, enclosed in a tube with a red rubber stopper. With great care, he swabbed the indented area, capturing the very essence of the assailant's dental impression. Back into the tube went the swab, sealed by the stopper. Mahaney labeled it meticulously with his initials and the coroner's case number. The tube was then placed in a 5x7-inch LA coroner's physical evidence envelope, marked with Sherri Rasmussen's name, a description of the contents, and their origin. He sealed the envelope, noting the precise date and time of its closure. As dawn broke over the San Fernando Valley, Mahaney completed his work. He headed straight to the coroner's office, where at 10:32 a.m. on February 25, 1986, the evidence custodian booked the swab into the official records. A single swab, perhaps holding the key to unraveling the complexities of this brutal crime, now lay in the hands of the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. Time would tell if this seemingly small piece of evidence could illuminate the dark corners of a case that had so far stumped even seasoned detectives. The day after Sherri's brutal murder, her parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, made the journey from Arizona to Los Angeles, their minds a swirling mix of grief and disbelief. Nels wasted no time in seeking out Detective Lyle Mayer, the man helming the investigation. Mayer briefed him on the current state of affairs, explaining that they were actively searching for one or more burglars responsible for the heinous act. John Ruetten, Sherri's husband, was no longer considered a suspect. In the midst of this grim exchange, Nels brought up a piece of information that tingled at the edges of his consciousness. A month or two prior, his daughter had voiced concerns about an encounter with an ex-girlfriend of John's, a woman who had audaciously confronted Sherri at her own workplace, a hospital. The kicker? This ex-girlfriend was an LAPD officer. Sherri's father was convinced that this unnamed woman could be at the heart of the matter. Mayer jotted down the potentially crucial detail in the case file, but curiously, it seemed he never pursued this lead. About a week later, the stolen BMW resurfaced, abandoned and as barren of clues as a deserted island. The car told investigators nothing that they didn't already know. 2 months rolled by as life in Los Angeles moved on. But just a few blocks from Sherri's condo, a burglary attempt snapped Mayer's attention back to the case. One of the burglars had brandished a gun. Were these men the key to unlocking Sherri's case? Mayer thought it plausible and shifted his focus to identifying them. Yet the individuals remained as elusive as phantoms, and the leads ran dry. By late October, Sherri's murder case was gathering cobwebs. The Los Angeles Times published a feature revealing a desperate plea from the Rasmussen family. They were offering a $10,000 reward for information leading to the suspects. Mayer was quoted in the article, detailing the suspects as 2 Latino men with heights ranging between 5'4" and 5'6". The clock was ticking, but for the Rasmussen family, time had already run out. They were simply waiting for justice to catch up. Now, 1986 was a year steeped in violence for the City of Angels. The city's dark underbelly was exposed, with 831 murders recorded, a number that seems unimaginable today, nearly triple the current rate. The LAPD's homicide detectives were under enormous pressure, their success or failure judged by a single metric, the clearance rate. By the end of that turbulent year, they had solved 538 out of 831 murders, a clearance rate that stood at 65%. To put it in perspective, 463 were cleared by arrest, and the other 75 fell under the category of cleared other. That's when there's a case where there was enough evidence for an arrest, but circumstances outside of the police's control prevented it, such as a suspect being dead or beyond extradition. For LAPD detectives, clearance rates were more than just numbers. They were akin to a batting average in baseball, a critical statistic monitored both within the unit and up the hierarchical chain. Importantly, once the calendar year ended, the numbers were locked in, unalterable by future arrests. This had an interesting effect. Detectives could inflate their current year's statistics by solving older cases, not just the new ones. In 2009, for example, the LAPD's Olympic Division had just 7 new murders, but managed to solve 15 cases in total, leading to an almost surreal clearance rate of 214%. Yet, as the clock struck midnight on December 31st, 1986, Sherri Rasmussen's murder remained unsolved. Her name became a haunting entry in the list of 293 unsolved cases that year, a chilling reminder that behind each statistic is a human life cut short, a family devastated, and a killer who eluded justice. Sherri became one of those cold cases, her story relegated to a folder in a filing cabinet, as detectives moved on to the next year's grim tally. The year 1986, the same year Sherri Rasmussen's life was brutally snuffed out in her home, was a turning point for criminal investigations. A seismic shift was about to rock the world of forensics. And that seismic shift was something that we utterly take for granted now, but it was a crime-solving tool that until quite recently had never been available to law enforcement. And what was it? Well, DNA evidence. Until then, law enforcement had been limited in their ability to conclusively match biological evidence from crime scenes to particular individuals. And not since Scotland Yard validated fingerprinting in 1901 had the detective's toolkit undergone such a transformative upgrade. Just 7 months after Rasmussen's murder, this new science made its dramatic debut in a criminal case. The stage was set thousands of miles away from Los Angeles in the quaint villages outside Leicester in the English Midlands. 2 15-year-old girls had been found dead, sexually assaulted, and strangled. It became painfully clear to both police and a petrified community that a serial predator was lurking among them. With a task force of 200 officers, the police zeroed in on a 17-year-old boy with an unsettling interest in one of the crime scenes. After a round of intense interrogations, the boy offered contradictory accounts of his actions, leaving the police frustrated and unsure. Enter Alec Jeffries, a local geneticist who introduced investigators to a process he had developed, which he called genetic fingerprinting. Forensic DNA testing was carried out on samples from the crime scenes and from the suspect. The results were nothing short of revolutionary. The same person had committed both heinous crimes, but it wasn't the teenager they had in custody. That 17-year-old boy became the first criminal suspect to be exonerated through DNA testing, and eventually, DNA evidence would lead to the conviction of a man named Colin Pitchfork in 1988. Back in Los Angeles, the impact of DNA technology began to ripple through the judicial system. In a 1989 rape case featuring 3 defendants, 2 of them immediately pleaded guilty upon learning that DNA evidence would be used against them. The 3rd defendant, an accused rapist named Henry Wilds, was prosecuted by Lisa Kahn, who would have handled the Rasmussen case had there been a suspect. DNA analysis confirmed Wilds' guilt. By the time O.J. Simpson's high-profile case rolled around in 1994, DNA had already entrenched itself as an irrefutable form of evidence. In fact, the words DNA were spoken no less than 10,000 times in court during the O.J. Simpson trial alone. While DNA didn't lead to a guilty verdict in Simpson's case, it wasn't because the science was on trial. Rather, issues like alleged racism and mishandling of evidence by the LAPD came into play. But O.J.'s case was the exception that proved the rule, and despite these leaps in forensic science, despite the central role that DNA evidence now played in the solving of homicide and other crimes, Sherri Rasmussen's case remained ice cold. The question loomed: Had DNA technology arrived too late for Sherri, or was it possible that this groundbreaking science could breathe new life into her case so many years later? Could the microscopic clues that seemed so inconsequential back in 1986 finally bring justice to a family stuck in a heart-wrenching limbo? Time, it seemed, would tell. As forensic science hurtled into the future, Sherri Rasmussen's case languished in a pit of inertia. Her parents, Nuys and Loretta Rasmussen, waged a ceaseless battle against time, but mostly against indifference. They held press conferences, renewed their offer of a $10,000 reward in the desperate hope that money might loosen lips and stir memories. John Ruetten, Sherri's widower, stood by them, the pain in his eyes palpable as he spoke to reporters about the living nightmare of not knowing who took Sherri away or why. But all of their efforts seemed futile. Nuys wrote to then Chief of Police Daryl Gates, imploring him to delve into the involvement of the ex-girlfriend of Ruetten's, a police officer no less. His letters echoed in a void. There was no response. When he mentioned his suspicion to the detectives, he was dismissed with a cynical retort. "You watch too much television." Perhaps this was an example of the solidarity of the thin blue line, but more likely it was simply the instinct of professionals who did not yet have a gut-level feeling for the efficacy of DNA evidence, but who also knew that cases as old as Sherri's, with as few obvious clues as hers had and no suspects, were unlikely to get solved. As the years rolled into the early 90s, the Rasmussens' hope waned but never extinguished. Loretta phoned the Van Nuys homicide unit so often she likely knew their hold music by heart. Finally, in 1993, they secured a face-to-face meeting with a detective, one who had inherited Sherri's cold case. But their pilgrimage yielded nothing but frustration. The detective had revisited the original case notes and even attempted to push the investigation forward, but to no avail. Nuys, Sherri's father, clutching at straws, brought up an article on DNA forensics he'd read. He even offered to bear the cost of conducting DNA tests at a private lab. The detective's refusal was the final blow. "Move on with your lives," he advised. And so, with heavy hearts, Loretta stopped calling. The calls had become futile, but they'd also been her last tether to her daughter. Meanwhile, deep in the recesses of the LA County coroner's freezer, next to countless other relics from unsolved cases, lay the swab from the bite mark on Sherri's arm. It was a silent witness, an inanimate object perhaps, but maybe if it were sentient, it would have wanted to help. For who or what does not desperately wish to be relevant, to be needed? Still, all my anthropomorphizing aside, for now, Sherri's family and that all-important swab from the bite mark on Sherri's arm had no choice but to wait for the LAPD's scrutiny to catch up to the crucial advances in DNA science. In the world of Los Angeles law enforcement, meanwhile, two figures emerged as the evangelists of DNA technology: District Attorney Lisa Kahn and LAPD Detective David Lampkin. Lampkin, a tech-savvy cop who'd cut his teeth in the Automated Information Division, found himself in a unique position to understand the transformative power of DNA forensics. In a realm dominated by shell casings and ballistic reports, he was a rare breed, an investigator who appreciated the revelatory power of biological evidence. His fascination with technology dated back to his early days dealing with archaic IBM punch card databases. He carried this thirst for innovation through his rise in the force, from his assignment to a sex crimes unit all the way to homicide investigations. With the grim specter of cold cases casting a shadow over the LAPD, Lampkin saw the dawn of the DNA era as a watershed moment. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he understood that justice has no expiration date. For these families, this stuff never goes away, he would often say. At a time when detectives could rarely afford the luxury to revisit cold cases due to the flood of new ones, Lampkin's investigative fervor proved invaluable, and the man had results to show for it: a staggering 100% personal clearance rate every year from 1991 to 1996. For him, DNA wasn't just a scientific term, it was a lifeline to justice for victims and their families. But the real game changer came on October 1998 when the FBI rolled out CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. The DNA database was a marvel, granting detectives access to an invaluable archive of DNA profiles from an array of potential suspects. 2 years later, a $50 million state grant designed to fund DNA testing in unsolved murders surfaced. It was the break that Lampkin and Lisa Kahn had been waiting for. They proposed a joint LAPD-DA task force to tackle the city's stockpile of cold cases. After navigating a maze of political red tape, their vision became reality. The LAPD's new cold case homicide unit was officially launched in November of 2001. To say this was a pivotal moment would be an understatement. Technology had finally caught up with the urgency for justice, giving the LAPD not just a new tool, but a new frontier. It was as if the past had been pulled into the present, offering families a glimmer of hope and detectives a renewed sense of purpose. For people like Lampkin and Kahn, this was not just a job, it was a moral imperative, a quiet revolution in the annals of policing. It held the promise that some of the city's oldest wounds might finally begin to heal. In the cramped quarters of a former janitorial closet that now served as the nerve center for the LAPD's cold case homicide unit, Detective David Lampkin and his team faced a monumental task. 7 detectives, confined to a place so small they had to choreograph their movements just to leave the room, began to sift through the sands of time. Their mission was audacious, tracing back to the city's earliest recorded homicide, an unsolved murder dating to 1899. But with biological evidence disintegrating over time, Lampkin recognized a hard truth. While I knew from experience that there was probably nothing left from earlier than 1960, he stated, setting the temporal boundaries of the unit's investigations from 1960 to 1998. By Lampkin's calculations, during that 39-year span, 23,713 murders had taken place in Los Angeles. The math was grim. 7,745 cases had gone cold, and they needed a strategy to triage this backlog. Rick Jackson, a member of the original unit, revealed their approach. Well, we looked for sexually motivated murders. There was a better chance for DNA. We also considered burglary murders, crimes where the perpetrator had spent a considerable time at the scene, thus increasing the chance of leaving behind good fingerprints. By the end of 2002, after months of meticulous scrutiny, the team had flagged 1,400 cases with the highest forensic potential for reinvestigation. Among these was the haunting 1986 murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Fast forward to December 19, 2003. The unit, methodically working through its caseload, formally requested DNA analysis for the Rasmussen case, but the request languished, lost in the shuffle of a criminally understaffed LAPD crime lab. More than a year passed until Jennifer Butterworth, a criminalist, stumbled upon the neglected file in December of 2004. Her initial tests on crime scene items like a blood-stained towel and a piece of fingernail revealed nothing beyond the victim's DNA. Then she noticed a long-forgotten item on the property sheet, a swab of a bite mark on Rasmussen's arm. It took another week to locate this key piece of evidence. The once pristine envelope holding the swab was now worn and tattered, a silent testament to the passage of time. Despite the envelope's condition, the tube was intact. Butterworth's analysis revealed a seismic twist in the story so far, a mixture of 2 DNA profiles. One matched Rasmussen's, the other presumably belonged to her killer. Yet, when cross-referenced with the FBI's CODIS database, this second profile hit a dead end, indicating that the individual was not in the database. But Butterworth noticed an anomaly. The DNA was marked XX, indicating the suspect was female, in a field dominated by XY markers signifying male suspects. This was a revelation. It was an unusual detail, and while Butterworth had no context about theories or potential suspects, she knew she had uncovered something significant. Her findings were compiled and sent to the cold case unit on February 8, 2005. The sands of time had shifted, revealing an unexpected, mysterious clue. The cold case unit, crowded into their constrained former janitorial closet workspace, now had a tangible lead in a case that had stumped investigators for nearly 2 decades. Butterworth's revelation didn't just challenge the prevailing narrative, it blew it apart. Somewhere in this maze of unsolved cases and lost time, the key to Sherri Rasmussen's murder had been hiding in plain sight. The statistical truth is, violent homicides perpetrated against women are virtually always, not always, but virtually always committed by men. So the realization that the killer could be a female opened up a whole new avenue of inquiry, adding an intricate layer to a puzzle that had perplexed investigators for so many years. This wasn't just another cold case anymore. It was a long slumbering mystery suddenly awake, and screaming to be solved. With the approval of Proposition 69, a ballot measure co-authored by Lisa Kahn, she was the DNA evidence early adopter in the Los Angeles DA's office, who we mentioned earlier in the story. So she co-authored a ballot measure, and when it was approved, there was a notable shift in the landscape of criminal investigations in California. The new legislation mandated the collection of DNA samples from all individuals arrested for a felony or a sex crime case, as well as from all state prison inmates convicted of such offenses. This unprecedented move resulted in the uploading of DNA profiles from tens of thousands of California inmates into the FBI's comprehensive database. Detective Lampkin's cold case unit at the LAPD found itself inundated with CODIS-based, quote, cold hits, unquote, generating reports that implicated suspects previously unknown to the detectives. The tide was turning, and the unit was unlocking the secrets of numerous unsolved cases, bringing resolution and a measure of justice to countless victims and their families. In the midst of this influx of new information, the DNA report from Jennifer Butterworth in the Sherri Rasmussen case emerged as a unique and tantalizing clue. The report suggested a potential paradigm shift in the case. The murderer might be a woman. This was an anomaly in violent crimes and stood out from the usual pattern of male perpetrators. However, despite its intriguing nature, the report did not lead directly to a specific suspect. Unlike the plethora of cold hits that were directly pointing toward potential culprits due to Proposition 69, the Rasmussen case remained a mystery. The DNA clue, although significant, was like a lone piece of a complex puzzle, waiting for the other pieces to be found and assembled. Perhaps because of the lack of a direct connection to a suspect, Butterworth's report ended up being filed away in the Rasmussen case file. The case itself, carrying with it the silent plea for justice from Sherri Rasmussen, was placed back on the shelf, and there it would remain, in limbo for a few more years, its secrets yet to be fully uncovered, and its mysteries still waiting to be solved. And so the story continued, with the truth lurking just out of reach, and the quest for justice pressing on, undeterred by the passage of time. As the calendar turned to early 2007, Detective David Lampkin, the pioneering leader of the LAPD's cold case homicide unit, decided that it was time to retire. Under his leadership, the unit had achieved remarkable success, solving more than 40 previously unsolvable old murder cases. Wow! More than 40, that is remarkable. When Detective David Lampkin departed, the mantle of responsibility for the cold case unit fell to Robert Bubb, another seasoned homicide detective. Detective Bubb inherited a team of 10 detectives and approximately 120 open cases. The cold case unit had been relocated to a marginally more spacious squad room on the 5th floor of Parker Center, the LAPD's infamously run-down headquarters. Despite the move, from a janitorial closet no less, space remained a precious commodity, and the unit found itself unable to accommodate the burgeoning number of murder books it had amassed. In an effort to manage this issue, detectives made the decision to box up cases that were not actively being investigated. These box files were then sent back to their respective divisions, provided there was sufficient space, or otherwise they were relegated to the archives of the LAPD. The Sherri Rasmussen case file, with all its complexities and unresolved questions, found itself in one such cardboard box, making its way back to the Van Nuys division in 2007. In a twist of fate, Detective Bubb would follow the trail of this case, accepting a transfer in March 2008 to lead the Van Nuys homicide unit, which had recently been depleted by the retirement of its supervising detective and 2 others. Bubb, alongside detectives Pete Barbara, Mark Martinez, and Jim Nuttall, formed the new team. By 2009, the landscape of crime in Van Nuys had changed significantly. What used to be 30 to 40 homicides a year had been reduced to an average of 5 to 7. Detective Bubb found this to be, quote, a very manageable number of murders for 3 guys to work, unquote. In February 2009, with their most recent case closed, Detectives Nuttall and Barba decided to delve into the cold cases, searching for a challenge. Their attention was drawn to the Sherri Rasmussen case. Detective Nuttall, upon receiving the case file, noted its considerable size. It was 4 books when it reached me, 4 books deep, he recalled. The case file, meticulously maintained over 23 years, provided a comprehensive chronological record of the investigation. As Detective Nuttall scrutinized the contents of the file, he came upon the 2005 DNA analysis report. The gender marker stood out starkly, in glaring contradiction to the original theory of the case. The DNA suggested a female perpetrator, not the two male burglars initially suspected. Quote, "That jumps off the page at you," unquote, Nuttall reflects, recognizing the pivotal nature of this discovery. "You have to go back to square one," he said. Thus began a new chapter in the investigation of the Sherri Rasmussen murder as detectives prepared to unravel the mystery anew, armed with the knowledge that they were possibly searching for a female assailant. The search for truth and justice was rekindled, and the quest to solve this decades-old case took on a renewed sense of urgency and determination. The detectives, armed with a new perspective and a resolute determination to uncover the truth, painstakingly revisited the entire investigation, this time with a fresh pair of eyes looking for a female suspect. Their thorough examination of the case file resulted in a list of 5 names, potential suspects who might hold the key to solving the mysterious case. Among these names was Stephanie Lazarus, previously mentioned in the original police investigation as John Ruetten's ex-girlfriend. A small, seemingly innocuous notation was next to her name, and it read, quote, P.O. unquote. Detective Nuttall, initially oblivious to the significance of these initials, decided to reach out to John Ruetten for clarification. Ruetten's revelation was nothing short of staggering. Stephanie Lazarus was not just an ex-girlfriend, she was a Los Angeles police officer. The enormity of this discovery was not lost on Nuttall. The idea that a fellow officer could be capable of such a heinous crime was jarring and an unsettling realization. Quote, "It was extremely difficult initially to process that possibility," unquote, Nuttall admitted, grappling with the implications of this new lead. Compelled to verify Lazarus's current status, the detectives turned to the LAPD's internal directory. There, to their astonishment, was Detective Stephanie Lazarus, still actively serving on the force. Nuttall wasted no time in contacting his superior, Detective Bub, to relay this critical piece of information. He recounted how Nels Rasmussen had raised suspicions about a police officer ex-girlfriend years ago, suspicions that now resurfaced with renewed urgency. The list of suspects compiled by the detectives was numbered 1 through 5. Despite the apparent connection and the looming shadow of suspicion, Stephanie Lazarus was placed at the bottom of the list, deemed the least likely suspect, and designated as suspect number 5. The irony of the situation was palpable. A member of their own rank, sworn to protect and serve, was now under the microscope, her past entanglements and possible motives subject to scrutiny. The detectives stood at the precipice of a daunting and potentially groundbreaking phase in the investigation as they prepared to delve deeper into the life and history of Stephanie Lazarus, unsure of what secrets and revelations lay in wait. The detectives of the Van Nuys squad approached the Sherri Rasmussen case with an extraordinary level of discretion and determination, establishing 2 crucial agreements amongst themselves. Firstly, they pledged to maintain an impenetrable cloak of secrecy, ensuring that neither the name Stephanie Lazarus or any discussions surrounding her would be exposed to prying ears or eyes. They were acutely aware of the potential repercussions. On the one hand, they risked tarnishing the reputation of a fellow officer, and on the other, they risked alerting her in case she was actually involved in the crime. Secondly, they committed to an unflinching pursuit of the truth, vowing to let the evidence guide their investigation regardless of where it might lead. Quote, "This was not a random act of violence towards Sherri Rasmussen," unquote, Nuttall reflected, emphasizing the gravity of their task. "Somebody on that list committed this crime," he said. The investigation pressed on quickly, and the Van Nuys detectives ruled out 3 of the 5 women on their list, determining that they lacked sufficient motive to inflict harm upon Sherri Rasmussen. This critical investigation left them with 2 remaining suspects, Stephanie Lazarus and another woman, a fellow nurse who had reportedly had sporadic confrontations with Sherri at the hospital. "We were teetering," Bub recalled, acknowledging the precarious nature of their investigation. The information at their disposal suggested that the relationship between Lazarus and John Ruetten had concluded the previous summer, leaving them without any concrete evidence of animosity. The previous summer to Sherri's murder, that is. In their relentless quest for answers, the detectives chose to investigate the nurse first, aiming to either confirm or eliminate her as a potential suspect. They managed to trace her to Northern California, and Bub coordinated with the local law enforcement to discreetly collect a DNA sample from her. In mid-April, a little over 2 months into the renewed investigation, the DNA report came back, yielding a negative result. The list of suspects had now been whittled down to a single name: Stephanie Lazarus. The detectives found themselves at a critical juncture, the weight of the investigation now squarely resting on their shoulders as they prepared to navigate the delicate and complex task of investigating one of their own. The quest for justice for Sherri Rasmussen had led them to an unexpected and unprecedented crossroads, and the path forward was fraught with challenges and uncertainties. Meticulously and systematically, the investigative team began to reconstruct the intricate web of connections between Stephanie Lazarus, John Ruetten, and Sherri Rasmussen, delving deep into the past to unravel the tangled history of their relationships. Lazarus and Ruetten's paths first crossed at the University of California, Los Angeles, where they both resided in the same dormitory and forged a close friendship. Their lives, it seemed, were on parallel tracks. Lazarus pursued a degree in political science, while Ruetten delved into the world of mechanical engineering. Both of them displayed a keen affinity for athletics and physical activity, an interest that likely played a key role in their initial bonding. Upon their graduation in the early 1980s, their relationship took a more intimate turn, evolving into an on-and-off-again romantic entanglement. In 1985, however, the dynamic shifted dramatically as Ruetten found love with Sherri Rasmussen, a rising star in the medical field who held the prestigious position of Director of Nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. The couple's connection was undeniable, and they soon found themselves sharing an apartment in Van Nuys, blissfully navigating the waters of their blossoming relationship. Lazarus, on the other hand, was grappling with the shift in her relationship with Ruetten. Despite her transition into a promising career with the LAPD, she struggled to let go of the emotional ties that bound her to Ruetten. Her presence became a constant in John and Sherri's lives, an uninvited third wheel that cast a shadow of discomfort over Rasmussen. During a birthday party thrown in Ruetten's honor by Lazarus, he disclosed the seriousness of his relationship with Rasmussen. The revelation left Lazarus heartbroken, prompting her to pen a poignant letter to Ruetten's mother in 1985, saying, quote, "I'm truly in love with John, and the past year has really torn me up. I wish it didn't end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand his decision," unquote. In an astonishing twist, Ruetten later testified that prior to his marriage to Rasmussen, he and Lazarus engaged in an intimate encounter, a misguided attempt to provide Lazarus with closure. Yeah, whatever. Contrary to their hopes, this act only served to intensify Lazarus's attachment, leading her to insert herself even more prominently in their lives. John Ruetten thought he could get his stalker to leave him and his new girlfriend alone by sleeping with her. Yeah, good plan, John. Good plan. As they sifted through the labyrinth of emotions and connections, the detectives could not help but feel the gravity, the emotional gravity of the situation, the palpable tension and unresolved feelings that lingered in the air, painting a vivid picture of a love triangle marred by jealousy, unrequited love, and a growing sense of desperation. In the face of Stephanie Lazarus's escalating infatuation, Sherri Rasmussen could not help but feel uneasy and alarmed. John Ruetten attempted to allay Sherri's fears, emphasizing that his relationship with Lazarus was purely platonic. No, it wasn't. However, Lazarus's fixation only deepened, culminating in a chilling confrontation at Rasmussen's workplace, where Lazarus issued a stark warning, quote, "If I can't have John, no one else will," unquote. Rasmussen, grappling with her unease, chose to trust Ruetten's reassurances, and the couple proceeded to tie the knot in November of 1985. They enjoyed a brief, idyllic period of marital bliss, oblivious to the storm that was brewing on the horizon. February 24th, 1986, marked a fateful turning point in their lives. Rasmussen, contemplating her mundane class schedule and nursing a recent back injury, decided to take a sick day. Ruetten, none the wiser, headed off to work, leaving his wife at home. Hours later, when Ruetten's attempts to reach Rasmussen went unanswered both at home and at her workplace, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling of concern. Yet he pressed on with his day, hoping that all was well. Upon his return home, Ruetten met with a horrifying scene. The answering machine, typically activated daily, lay dormant. A bloody handprint stark against the wall near the panic button of the alarm told a story of desperation and struggle. The room was in disarray, littered with broken objects, a testament to the violence that had transpired. Meanwhile, Lazarus, a 26-year-old police officer in her third year with the LAPD, remained seemingly unscathed by the tumult. In the ensuing years, her career flourished. By 1993, she descended to the rank of detective, and in 1996, she found personal fulfillment in marriage to a fellow LAPD officer. Together, they adopted a little girl, building a life and a family. By 2006, Lazarus had secured a prestigious position in the department's art theft detail, a coveted post rare in the realm of Los Angeles police work. Throughout her lengthy and distinguished career, she maintained an unblemished record, free from any allegations of misconduct or involvement in any use of force incidents. As they delved into the narrative of Sherri Rasmussen's murder, detectives were faced with the daunting task of reconciling the Stephanie Lazarus of the past a woman driven by obsession and capable of issuing sinister threats, with the respected officer and family woman she had become. The stark contrast between these two facets of her identity posed a significant challenge as the team endeavored to uncover the truth and seek justice for Sherri Rasmussen. The detectives from Van Nuys, unwavering in their determination, continued to unravel the threads of the perplexing case, each detail seemingly aligned to create a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Mark Martinez, an officer with a wealth of experience, noted that in the mid-1980s a .38 caliber firearm was a common choice for LAPD officers, both as a backup and for off-duty purposes. This was a significant truth, as the ballistics report from the Rasmussen murder indicated that a .38 caliber weapon had been used. Detectives decided to delve deeper, searching the California State Gun Registry for any firearms registered under Stephanie Lazarus's name. The search yielded results, including a .38 caliber firearm, which, in a spine-tingling coincidence, had been reported stolen just 13 days after Sherri Rasmussen's murder. Keen to gather more information, the detectives promptly obtained a copy of the stolen gun report. Lazarus had walked into the Santa Monica Police Department, identified herself as an LAPD officer, and reported that her vehicle, parked near the Santa Monica Pier, had been burglarized. She detailed the incident, describing how the lock on the driver's side door had been compromised and that a blue gym bag containing various items, including her Smith & Wesson 5-shot .38 revolver, had been taken. This stolen weapon posed a significant roadblock to the investigation. Without the firearm itself or a bullet confirmed to have been fired from it proving or disproving that it was the weapon used in the Rasmussen murder was an impossibility. Meanwhile, Detective Nuttall had established communication with Nels Rasmussen, Sherri's father, whose intelligence and tenacity left a lasting impression. During their conversation, Nuttall implored Nels to recount every detail, to walk him through the entirety of the events from A to Z. Nels complied, revisiting the details he had shared with detectives back in 1986, including the ominous interactions between Sherri and a police officer who had previously been involved with John Ruetten. Given the precarious nature of the investigation, with its delicate and potentially explosive implications, Nuttall treaded carefully, ensuring not to reveal too much. However, he assured Nels, "Give me time to do what I have to do, and I think maybe I'll be able to have an answer for you." In this, Nuttall acknowledged the gravity of the situation and the imperative need for diligence, all the while understanding the profound responsibility he carried to bring resolution and justice to the Rasmussen family. The progression of the investigation into Stephanie Lazarus as a cold case murder suspect brought the detectives to a critical juncture. A potential case of this magnitude, implicating an LAPD detective, would invariably find its way to the Robbery Homicide Division, known as RHD, an elite unit tasked with handling the most sensitive and high-profile murder investigations in the city. Bub, a seasoned investigator and a veteran of RHD, was acutely aware of the gravity of the situation. He was resolute in his commitment to presenting an impeccably prepared case to the division, leaving no room for error. A key element to building the case was obtaining a sample of Lazarus's DNA to compare with the swab taken from the bite mark found on the crime scene. The detectives had deliberated on the idea of acquiring the DNA sample surreptitiously. However, Bub noted, quote, "We kicked around the idea of doing it ourselves, doing surreptitious DNA, but recognized the complexities and potential pitfalls of such an undertaking. And the circumstances such as they were, there would have been too many variables involved and too much potential for a screw-up. So, we felt it best that if we're going to do this and hand the package to RHD, we're going to hand it to them with everything done correctly," unquote. With a clear course of action in mind, Bub took the next crucial step. He briefed his lieutenant in the Van Nuys division, effectively making him the first person outside of Bub's immediate unit to be made aware that an LAPD detective was now a subject in a cold case murder investigation. Swiftly, the captain of the Van Nuys division and the chief of the Valley Bureau were also brought into the loop. Bub underscored the uncertainty of the situation to his superiors, noting, "We explained that this could still turn out not to be her. There were some coincidences, sure, but there was nothing definitive for us at this point." Following this, a decision was made. Bub's unit would retain the case until Lazarus's DNA sample was obtained, and they started to plan just exactly how to do that. The ensuing days were fraught with an almost tangible tension as the crime lab technicians labored over their equipment, conducting the delicate and complex task of DNA analysis. Their work was not just a matter of science. It was the critical juncture upon which the future of the investigation hinged. With meticulous care, they amplified the genetic markers, cross-referenced the loci, and slowly but surely the genetic profile began to take shape. a ghostly blueprint emerging from the biological traces left behind so many years ago. The long-awaited results coalesced, and the detectives found themselves in the grip of a profound anticipation. The prospect of finally putting a name to the elusive evidence from that brutal day in 1986 was on the horizon, and the atmosphere in the office was thick with the gravity of what that meant. For Detective Bub, his day off on May 29th was abruptly interrupted by a call that would resonate through the annals of the case. It was the technician from the crime lab, and the message he conveyed was simple yet earth-shattering. It's a match. The DNA was a match for Stephanie Lazarus. The affirmation came as a vindication of the detective's unwavering pursuit of the truth, and yet it also brought a sobering reality to light. It was a pivotal moment, confirming a connection to one of their own, an LAPD detective. The knowledge bore heavy implications for the integrity of the department and the justice they stood for. The confirmation of the match propelled the case into a new phase, fraught with legal and moral complexities that would test the department's resolve and the detectives' dedication to their oath. It was a moment that underscored the often unsung tenacity and meticulous nature of detective work. They had toiled away from the spotlight, relentlessly pursuing leads and piecing together evidence, often in the face of skepticism and the fading trails left by time. Now their steadfastness had paid off, as the narrative of the crime was rewritten, and they were poised on the cusp of a breakthrough that held the promise of closure for a grieving family, haunted by decades of unanswered questions. With the DNA match now cementing Lazarus as a prime suspect, the detectives faced a new set of challenges. How would they proceed with the arrest? How could they ensure the integrity of the case against one of their own? These questions demanded answers, and the answers would shape the course of justice in a case that had long seemed destined to remain a mystery. The Los Angeles Police Department found itself in a maelstrom of introspection and circumspection, as the case that had once seemed to wither in the cold shadow of the unsolved now thrust one of their own into the glaring light of suspicion. The halls of Parker Center, once a symbol of law enforcement acumen, were now a backdrop of an internal paradox that no one had anticipated. Stephanie Lazarus, a respected member of the art theft detail, whose professional life was dedicated to the restoration of stolen beauty, was linked inextricably to an act that had violently stolen far more than artifacts. It had stolen a life, the life of Sherri Rasmussen. The detectives assigned to the case, acutely aware of the delicacy and gravity of their task, proceeded with a mix of dogged determination and conscientious precision. The close proximity of Lazarus's workstation to the RHD squad room was not merely a physical challenge, but a profound psychological one. The air within the division became heavy with an unspoken tension, as colleagues who had once shared coffee and casework were now separated by a chasm of betrayal and incredulity. This complexity necessitated a discreet and strategic approach to the case. The robbery and homicide detectives, led by an unwavering sense of duty, were compelled to delve into a case that by its very nature threatened to unravel the fabric of trust and camaraderie that held the department together. They were not just pursuing a suspect, they were navigating an intricate web of relationships, each with its own potential for conflict of interest. The detectives found themselves at a crossroads of law enforcement and moral duty. They were to pursue one of their own with the same zeal and thoroughness that they would any other suspect. In doing so, they would have to strip away the fellowship that comes with the badge and look at the facts with dispassionate objectivity. This was not just a test of their investigative skills, but of their very ethos as guardians of the law. With the evidence in hand and the path forward clear, yet fraught with challenges, the detectives prepared to execute their next move. A move that would bring them face to face with a colleague, a detective who was now the prime suspect in a case that had haunted them for over 2 decades. It was a moment that would redefine the meaning of justice within the walls of the LAPD and beyond. The gravity of the information contained within those 4 binders could not be overstated. Each page, each report, each piece of evidence was a testament to a narrative that had spanned decades, a saga that encapsulated grief, mystery, and an elusive search for justice that had long evaded the grasp of those who sought it. The transfer of this colossal case to Detectives Stearns and Jeremio was more than a procedural handoff. It was a solemn passage of duty from one set of hands to another, both united by a commitment to the unwavering truth and the somber responsibility that came with it. The detectives' unenviable task of breaking the news to the prosecutors was approached with both deference and urgency. Bub and Nuttall, veterans of many such briefings, understood the need to paint a comprehensive picture for the prosecutors, one that would enable them to grasp the full scope of a case mired in the complexities of time, emotion, and now departmental entanglement. As the prosecutors absorbed the enormity of the case before them, they were not just confronting a criminal act, but they were also facing the daunting task of navigating a legal battle that had implications reaching far beyond the courtroom. The case of Sherri Rasmussen was not merely about the act of murder, it was about the integrity of the institution that was now charged with prosecuting one of its own. With meticulous care, Stearns and Jaramillo began their journey into the abyss of the case, cognizant that every step had to be calculated with precision. The sanctity of the legal process and the public's trust in the justice system hinged on their ability to remain partial and thorough, irrespective of the ties that bound the LAPD community together. In the hallowed halls of justice, where prosecutors readied themselves for a case that no one had anticipated, the detectives stood as the vanguard of a truth that would be scrutinized, not only by the defense, but by the watchful eyes of a city that placed its trust in the badge. In the secluded confines of the conference room at the DA's office, the atmosphere was dense with a meticulous tension as Detectives Stern and Jaramillo engaged in a tactical discourse over their impending approach. Their strategy sessions were akin to plotting a delicate surgical strike. Every move, every word, every nuance was dissected and considered. They were acutely aware that the forthcoming interaction with Lazarus would be pivotal. It was not merely a matter of asking the right questions, but of orchestrating the conversation in such a way that it would prevent Lazarus from becoming defensive or evasive. Meanwhile, as Nuttall and his colleague Sanchez prepared to meet with the Rasmussens, they carried the weight of the investigation with them, a weight made heavier by the years of longing for answers that had burdened the family. Nuttall understood that he was stepping into a space filled with decades of sorrow and expectation. The Rasmussens family's pain was a silent specter at the table, and Nuttall felt the pressing need to honor that grief with integrity and empathy, even as he guarded the sensitive developments of the case. The journey was not just a physical one across state lines to Arizona, it was an emotional and ethical trek to the heart of a family's darkest moment. The detectives' roles extended beyond that of investigators. They were bearers of hope, cautiously measured in their disclosures. Each word they spoke to the Rasmussens had to be weighed against the potential impact it might have on the family's emotions and the investigation's progress. Back in Los Angeles, the walls of the conference room were privy to the intricate planning of an interview that would need to maintain an equilibrium between investigative rigor and the caution due to interviewing a fellow officer. Every hypothetical scenario was played out. Every possible response from Lazarus anticipated and countered with a strategy. The detectives were not just preparing to interview a colleague, they were preparing to confront a paradox, a guardian of the law who might in fact be its transgressor. Among these meticulous preparations, the threat of a leak loomed. The more people who knew of the impending arrest, the greater the risk became. It was a race against time and secrecy, with each participant in the case bearing a fragment of the truth, collectively holding their breath until justice could be safely pursued in the light of day. Detective Nuttall's mission to speak with the Rasmussen family was a delicate dance of revelation and concealment. As he stood before them, he had to embody the professionalism of the LAPD while navigating the undercurrents of unspoken knowledge. He knew that Nels Rasmussen's acute perception and long-standing engagement with the case would make it a formidable challenge to keep the critical information just beneath the surface, out of sight but implicitly acknowledged in every assurance he gave. In the simmering desert heat of Arizona, the conversation with the Rasmussens would unfold with a rehearsed caution. While back in Los Angeles, in the cold sterility of the DA's office, plans were laid with a precision that bespoke both the duty and the dread of what was to come. Each team, in their respective roles, moved closer to a moment of revelation that had been decades in the making, a moment when the past would collide with the present, and the silent prayers for justice would find their echo in the actions of those determined to deliver it. The scene at the Rasmussen residence was full of mixed emotions, anticipation, grief, and a quiet strength that had sustained the family through years of waiting. Detective Nuttall, a seasoned officer of the law accustomed to the ebb and flow of criminal investigations, found himself momentarily adrift in the sea of sorrow and resilience that filled the Rasmussen home. It was a reminder that beneath the procedural aspects of his work lay the profoundly human element of loss and longing for resolution. When he entered, Sherri's mother Loretta immediately gave Detective Nuttall a hug. Her embrace was more than a mere physical gesture. It was a bridge built over years of pain, a silent communication of gratitude and trust in the midst of an ordeal that had stretched over 2 decades. It signified an unspoken understanding that the detectives were not just officers performing their duty, but allies in a quest for justice. Nuttall pled for the Rasmussens' patience, and it was more than just a professional request. It was an acknowledgement of the shared journey they were on, a recognition of the arduous path that the family had walked thus far. He was asking for their trust, knowing full well the gravity of what was being asked of them. It was an appeal to hold on just a little longer, even as they stood on the precipice of potential closure. Upon leaving the Rasmussen household, the detectives carried with them not just the burden of their professional responsibility, but also the emotional charge of the family's hopes. The gravity of their commitment to the case was palpable. It was a solemn vow that they were unwaveringly set on fulfilling. As they made their way back to Los Angeles, they were acutely aware that the case that was unfolding was not just a series of events to be analyzed and understood. It was a narrative of a real life, a story of tragedy that had befallen a family they knew. It was a story of tragedy that demanded to be brought to a just resolution. The decision to interview Stephanie Lazarus within the confines of the Parker Center's jail division was a calculated maneuver, steeped in both tactical prudence and psychological acumen. It ensured that the investigators could maintain control of the environment, minimizing the risk of an unpredictable confrontation. The setting would be official yet neutral, a space familiar to Lazarus, reducing the likelihood of her becoming immediately defensive or alarmed. It was a stark departure from the often cinematic portrayal of catching a suspect off guard in a dramatic public display. Here the objective was not spectacle, but safety and efficacy. Chief Bratton's directive was clear. The apprehension of Stephanie Lazarus was to be handled with the utmost care, and she was to be taken when she did not have access to a firearm. This was not just for the sake of the detectives and the suspect herself, but for the integrity of the process and the respect due to the gravity of the charges at hand. The approach the detectives took reflected a profound sense of responsibility and a deep understanding of the potential implications of their actions. This was not merely an arrest. It was a moment that would resonate within the halls of the LAPD for years to come, a moment when the department's ability to police its own would be scrutinized under the harshest of lights. On the day of the interview, the air in the Parker Center was thick with tension. The detectives were acutely aware of the fine line they tread, balancing the need for due process with the safety of all involved. There would be no room for error, no second chances. The planning that went into this moment was reflective of the magnitude of the situation. A fellow officer, a detective no less, was about to be confronted with evidence linking her to a murder. The investigative team devised a strategic plan to conduct an interview with Stephanie Lazarus, carefully considering the potential risks and sensitivities involved. They opted for a location within the Parker Center's jail division, a floor directly beneath both the robbery-homicide division and the art theft detail where Lazarus was stationed. The jail division's protocol prohibiting firearms provided a natural and unobtrusive pretext for all parties, including Stearns, Jaramillo, and Lazarus, to relinquish their weapons before entering, ensuring a safe environment for the interview, which, as Stearns and Jaramillo knew, was an explicit directive from Chief Bill Bratton. The ruse devised to engage Lazarus involved a faux request for her assistance in interviewing a jailed suspect purported to have information pertinent to an art theft case, a scenario well within the scope of her professional duties. Upon her arrival in the interrogation room, outfitted with recording equipment to meticulously document the proceedings, the detectives planned to subtly transition the discussion toward the Rasmussen case. Lazarus, with her extensive experience in law enforcement and numerous arrests made, was undoubtedly well versed in her rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel. The critical unknown was the duration she would choose to engage in the conversation before potentially invoking these rights. Everything I knew about Stephanie, she was sharp, not all observed, cognizant of the challenge they faced. The primary objective for Stearns and Jaramillo was to sustain the dialogue for as long as possible, all the while reassuring Lazarus of her freedom to depart at any juncture. Technically, she was free to leave. However, the detectives harbored a crucial piece of information that Lazarus was likely unaware of. The moment she decided to conclude the interview and exit the room, she would be apprehended, her statements notwithstanding. This critical interview was scheduled for the early hours of Friday, June 5, 2009. In tandem with these developments, Chief Bratton emphasized the importance of personally informing the Rasmussen family of the arrest, preempting any potential exposure through media channels. Detective Nuttall was entrusted with this delicate task. He reached out to the Rasmussens, indicating the necessity of another meeting on Friday morning. When Nels mentioned a prior doctor's appointment, Nuttall subtly underscored the significance of their meeting, suggesting, "Nels, if you can reschedule it, you may want to reschedule." The stage was set for a crucial moment in the investigation, with the detectives acutely aware of the gravity of the situation and the profound implications of their actions. At the dawn of June 5, 2009, a day poised to become a significant chapter in the protracted investigation, Detective Dan Jaramillo approached Stephanie Lazarus at her desk, discreetly equipped with a wire to capture every nuance of their interaction. "Stephanie," he inquired with a tone of professional camaraderie, introducing himself and setting the stage for the critical conversation that was to follow. Jaramillo, maintaining a guise of seeking assistance, explained that he was engrossed in a case involving a jailed suspect purportedly possessing information related to art theft, a domain presumed to be within Lazarus's expertise. "I don't know much about this stuff," Jeremio conveyed, aiming to enlist Stephanie's cooperation. "You can kind of talk to him. You can see if he's for real." Lazarus, unsuspecting of the true nature of the request, agreed to assist, affirming, "Sure thing, Dan. Just for like 5 minutes or something," Jeremio added, attempting to downplay the significance of the task. Upon her arrival in the interrogation room, Lazarus was met by both Jeremio and Detective Greg Stearns. Swiftly, they deviated from the fabricated narrative involving stolen art and instead transitioned to discussing her connection to John Ruetten, an ex-boyfriend. Aware of her current marital status, the detectives emphasized their intention to provide a private space, away from the prying eyes and whispering voices of colleagues. For over an hour, Stearns and Jeremio engaged Lazarus in conversation that delicately navigated the boundaries between treating her as a potential witness and as a criminal suspect. The discourse was artfully managed, subtly weaving through various topics, yet always gravitating back toward the central subject, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. It was only when Jeremio introduced the possibility of obtaining a DNA swab from Lazarus, coupled with the mention of potential DNA evidence at the crime scene, that the seasoned detective expressed her desire to consult with an attorney. Proclaiming her astonishment at the turn of events, Lazarus opted to exit the room 68 minutes after the conversation had commenced. However, her journey was to be abruptly halted in the jail's hallway, where she was confronted by other detectives from the Robbery-Homicide Division. Without further ado, they placed Lazarus in handcuffs, a climactic moment that had been over 2 decades in the making. From the stark confines of the interrogation room, Stephanie Lazarus was transported to Linwood, a jail facility exclusively housing female inmates in Los Angeles County, effectively ensuring her separation from the freedom she once knew. Held on an imposing bail amount of $10 million, Lazarus's fate was sealed. On June 8, 2009, merely days after her surprising arrest, she found herself formally charged with the heinous murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The ensuing legal battle was complex and intense, as one would expect given the nature of the crime and the perpetrator's background in law enforcement. Lazarus, once a respected detective of the Los Angeles Police Department, now stood accused of a crime most foul. In March of 2012, the culmination of years of legal proceedings and investigations resulted in a verdict. Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to serve 27 years to life at the California Institution for Women. In the years that followed her conviction, Lazarus sought reprieve through various legal avenues, attempting to appeal her case multiple times. However, the lower courts have remained steadfast, upholding the conviction and ensuring that Lazarus serves the time deemed appropriate for her actions. Her potential eligibility for parole in 2034 looms in the distance, but for now she remains a prisoner, her past actions dictating her present and her future. Sherri Rasmussen's life was cut short in a brutal act of violence, but her story and the relentless pursuit of justice on her behalf will never be forgotten. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.